Gentlemen, we're going to start talk a little bit here about human ethics considerations, which for many researchers are at the forefront of attention for the sort of work that we're discussing. And once again, I invite others to kick in observations. This is also an area where my colleague Kevin Stanley has a great deal of experience. Unfortunately, he's had to step out for a group meeting, but he'll be back later and might be able to contribute some additional comments. We noted in some of the discussion back and forth, there's certain types of information collected via these phones that is particularly sensitive in character. These include the names of devices, geographic information. And for ethics boards, these can serve as notable areas of concern. By names of devices, I mean Bluetooth names. So it might say Dave's phone or Jane's iPhone or something like that. And the information that's stored on that is provided by the participant as part of setting up their phone. And it is visible to other people outside of the use of the Ethica app, any of the IEPI apps, any of the other similar monitoring technologies. However, naturally when we're collecting data for studies, there's a concern that some of the other data being able to be cross-linked with these names of devices could be identifying. So that's been a point of concern for us. Another point of concern has been the use of the availability of geographic information. It just needed some justification or some statements from us of the benefits of including that in our study. Because without scrambling, it can be pretty clear where someone's spending their time. And it could suggest someone's home, for example. And in principle, with enough effort, even given the noisy nature of that data, one could probably zero in on where a given participant lives, and through appropriate or through inappropriate investigation could identify who that person might be in the participant pool. There are ways of scrambling this data. There's been some neat work done. I remember Barbara Entwistle at one NIH conference was discussing scrambling of geographic data, rotating and flipping so that you couldn't recognize actual streets or what have you. But the point is that geographic information can give a lot of specific items away, and ethics boards often want to have confidence that you know what you're going to do with it, you're getting it for a good reason, in short, that the benefits outweigh the risks. Our ethics board hasn't been too, very concerned about this, but certainly they don't want us to just throw it in there on a lark and not have a clear understanding how it relates to our research questions. Another area of feedback from our ethics board relates to network recruitment. We've talked about this, but they do not feel comfortable for very understandable reasons with one participant giving the name of a potential participant to the researchers. They would like instead any potential participants who wish to join because of that network contact to proactively contact the research team and say, I would like to opt in, so that identifying information doesn't have to pass from the from one participant to another without that other person's permission, right? They don't want me to name Mohammed without Mohammed know that I'm naming him for a study with an app to monitor health behavior. Another type of issue is notifiable behavior. So behavior that might be might require notification to medical authorities or to law authorities, law-breaking activity. And for certain vulnerable populations for which Ethica has been is about to be used or could be used, including things like sex trade workers, individuals using illegal drugs, narcotics, such as with intravenous drug use. These are very real possibilities that an individual's data could include representation of activities that involve law-breaking. Even in something like jaywalking, in principle, could be picked up on the device. And in these cases, as I mentioned earlier, we put in wording to indicate that we are subject to subpoenas and that you should desist from law-breaking activity during a study. It's something where, as Mohammed mentioned, certificates of confidentiality in the states have been secured by research teams there to say that the data is exempted from legal seizure, and
they've been tested. Is that right?
Yeah, I think certificates of confidentiality have been tested in the states. Now, whether it's been tested for this sort of data, no, but they certainly have been tested in other types of research, such as research with vulnerable populations.
So if you ask, have you used those drugs in the last 24 hours,
right,
that information then can't be
right,
subpoenaed later. And
that's right.
Cross-linked with the fact that they might have been going through a divorce and the child was in the care and all
right,
that stuff.
Exactly. That's my understanding about the operation of those certificates of confidentiality, which have, I think, a pretty long history in the States. I can't speak to the Canadian situation with respect to them. I suspect there are corresponding items, but my understanding is that they are honored for now, with respect to most. Now, there's an interesting question with respect to the Patriot Act, for example, the U.S. government's regulations governing national security and personal communication. Would it be subject to Patriot Act seizure? And my guess is that it would. So our university actually has concerns about data storage in the States for individuals from outside the States, such that their data might be subject to the Patriot Act. That's a consideration that comes into play in some of our work, maybe a statement and a consent form or what have you.
This is another question, I guess. So,
yeah,
if data are collected in Australia and are stored in Saskatchewan, right, are they, in a notifiable behaviour occurs in Australia, is that person subject to Australian law or to Canadian law if they want to access the data? Presumably it would be Canadian law. Maybe this is not for this.
This is a very interesting question, and it's a question where I think we could have a brief discussion with our ethics board, yeah, and at least have a full framing of the question that they could bring to the appropriate lawyers. There are also lawyers involved in the contract side of our work who might be able to answer that off the top of their head. I'm not someone who has the requisite depth of understanding of legal precedent to know what applies there. I suspect it's pretty clear cut, yeah, but that full elucidation of it would take at least a brief inquiry. One thing where our board has been quite sensitive is the whole idea of smartphone use in vehicles, giving explicit provisos that under no conditions, reminders, despite reminders, in spite of questionnaires popping up, You absolutely do not use your smartphone while driving a vehicle, whether it's a tractor or a car or what have you. I mentioned the special relationship, clinician-patient, and general power relationships, right? These are things to which the ethics board is sensitive, and you know, the arrangement there is often simple, but it involves more work. It's having someone else involved who can mediate that relationship. So that rather than the clinician suggesting it to a patient that they might be involved in the study, you have someone else there who has no power relationship with that person, who approaches them and inquires. Or you have, you know, signs up on the wall that notify people that they're looking for participants, and if the person inquires, then there can be some discussion with the third party, but not with the clinician. Again, the idea being you don't want the patient to come away with a mistaken belief that their care, the quality of their care will be mediated by their involvement in the study. And then finally, as you might expect, our ethics boards are more sensitive on the area of intervention studies. And when studies involving tools like Ethica transition to an intervention context, that's where our biomedical board becomes involved. It's interesting because the biomedical board is often, so the behavioral board is used to dealing with studies that involve lower risk than the biomedical. The biomedical board is involved with many studies involving drugs or pharmaceuticals of one sort or another, or medical devices, which are, and intervention strategies, which could potentially cause a fair bit of harm. And for them, for the biomedical board, when Kevin and I have had discussions on them, the types of studies that we conduct, even with potential intervention components, are often fairly minimal risk compared to what they usually deal with. And meanwhile, for our behavioral board, they're used to dealing with a lot of minimal risk studies, and so we may actually get a little bit more scrutiny there. I'm not sure. Kevin, do you want to opine on that? I mean, in other words,
Yeah,
it's not necessarily a draconian thing to go to the biomedical board.
No, quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
The IRBs are committees and therefore subject to behaviors of committees. So you get different results from different places and different times. But generally speaking, death is not a possible side effect of what we're doing. Whereas with a lot of the drug trials, that could actually be. Yeah. So, they're like, oh, well, no one's going to die. This is pretty straightforward. Behavioral tend to be a little more intent on particularly the privacy side of things. But ours has been quite sane. I mean, most of the stuff we've had to do with more kind of just legalistic wording, massages.
Exactly. I think there's going to be some discoveries involved as we proceed towards studies which involve infants and children in the youngest years, and in the context of counseling relationships and behavioral modification strategies that are leveraged by tools like Ethica. I think the potential for harm may be one that's scrutinized more, and it's a bit harder to test.
In all of my dealings with all of the IRBs that I've talked to, it really comes down to informed consent and the ability of the participant to provide informed consent, or for a reasonable period.
And assent for children.
Yeah, assent.
Or referral to children. Yeah.
As long as you're within that box, you're generally okay, as long as you don't. I wouldn't recommend dropping it on your IRB. I would go talk to them nicely first and let them know it's coming. Because it can be a bit of a shock the first time you see it. You know, generally, there's extensive precedent that people can consent to give this kind of data away. If you can establish, then you've got a strong consenting process, and that re-identification is difficult. You're basically done. And one of the things we've had to do, the other corollary is we have to commit to not cross-link the data in a way that might make it identifiable.
Yeah.
Trivially, you can do it with a phone book, because you basically know exactly where the person lives,
Yeah.
and you go to the phone
Yeah,
book, and
pretty
you find out who's at that address, right? So, you basically have to commit not to do that, and then by and large, you're committed.
So, one of the comments, as Kevin mentioned, engage early, engage often with your RDB or IRB, depending how it's specified in your country note, and really develop a relationship. This is something Kevin and I did, and I think we're still enjoying the fruits of those early meetings. So we engaged, I think it was maybe upwards of 6 months ahead of our first system being available. We went and we said, look, we can do this technically. You know, what are the bounds on this? What are the sensitivities? What are the concerns? How comfortable are you in this sort of situation under different contexts? You know, clinical encounters in an inpatient population, individuals, you know, who are being monitored clinically but circulate to home. Population health issues where people are sort of being monitored in situ in their communities. And we had a really good set of discussions, and that set the tone in a very positive way, I think, for all the subsequent years. And one very important point of this is that coming partly out of that, we had people who later turned into point people for the work. So in other words, that discussion 7.5 years ago or whatever, those people are still around. It's maybe a testament to U of S's continuity of presence. The staff members are still around. The board is very different. The board comes and goes with faculty, but the staff members are still around, and we have very close working relationships with some of them who know the rigmarole with our studies and basically what's involved, and have a long history of understanding how we approach things and et cetera. And this stands in dramatic contrast to what happened to some of our colleagues at other institutions who are bringing this for the first time and got an overzealous new staff member at the board who decided this would be an interesting thing to scrutinize and find every hole in it and so on. And so I think engaging early, far before you launch a study, and developing a relationship is really important. Pointing IRBs to precedent, in terms of other people doing this sort of work, past applications of this very system. Kevin had some interesting comments on end-user license agreements and their possible use as precedent as well. Do you want to make a comment on that at all?
Well, yeah, just read the EULA for Pokemon Go. They're much more invasive than anything that we're doing. And played in by millions of people in hundreds of countries. So,
and to say informed consent is stretching it.
And to say informed consent is stretching it a bit. So, if this is okay, then, you know, certainly the watered down and much more tightly sensitive stuff that we're doing is fine. Even beyond Pokemon Go, just look at the EULA for your iPhone or your Android phone. They basically get you this data, not as often, but they're collecting this data. Yeah, it's legal precedent is clearly out there. You have to be a little more careful here. That would be my only caveat on that. They have stronger privacy laws there, so there might be some extra verbiage, but it's still totally allowed.
And corporate actors are collecting tremendous volumes of this information. There was some study which Kevin had mentioned at one point. This is several years back now, but of the apps that were available on one of the major stores, it may have been Google Play, something like a large fraction, I thought it was something like 40% or something, collected much more information than was clearly required for their function. So they had a big ask associated with them, and partly because of that, Android has been, as a platform, becoming more strict about declaring these things and making the choice ostensibly available to individuals. But often again, saying informed consent is really stretching it. Warning and consent form about legal obligations. Kevin, this is something we were discussing before you came in, but are you aware if Canada has anything similar to what in the US is certificates of confidentiality, which basically exempt data collected by a study from legal subpoena?
No, not explicitly, but there is case law around this. I had a chat with the chair a while back about this, and
I've seen that also.
You can basically stand on your principles, but it's a little bit like the press refusing to disclose a source under subpoena. There's no guarantee the judge is going to buy it.
Yeah.
Right? And so just as kind of protecting our own backsides,
right,
as well as kind of telling the participants, we basically say, look, if we get subpoenaed, we're going to disclose the data to the court under the terms of the subpoena, but only in terms of the subpoena. We have access to the entire database. It's a little, like, what is it from your side about this?
Nobody, I mean, there's just as much issues with surveys, paper-based surveys.
Exactly.
Because I've had people wanting to, like we were talking about paper-based surveys, and there was one person that was concerned about stating how many children were living with her, or who was living in her house, because then that deemed her unfit for certain subsidies or whatever. And that information, because it's de-identified when we enter it, like, we know that it's her, but nobody else does.
Yep.
So, like, I don't know what would happen if they subpoenaed our records, because they'd also have to ask us for the de-identified tracking system, right? So,
right. And that could be destroyed by the time they ask.
Exactly, if it's after, and you only keep the data for 5 years or whatever it is. And I think when I was going through the consent form, we did the data release one. The 3 options that people were given, they have to just allow the aggregate. The next one is they had to allow individual traces to go, and then for publications and for presentations. And then the third one was they would allow the individual tracers for to be put on the website as per funding requests or whatever. And that one, some people did not select because they were a little bit more concerned about people figuring out where they were. But even most people were like, oh, well, they can figure out that I live in this house, but they don't know that it's me. Like, if they look at them. And it's just letting them know that once the information's put on the internet, we can't control it. And that was the only, most people, I mean, I only had 20, so it's hard to say, and I was all done in person, so I don't know how different that would be if you're doing it consent-based on the app. Like you were talking about just
Right.
doing the consent and the registration all on the app. I don't know
Right.
how different it would look at that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be done in the app, but it could also be done via web-based mechanisms before you download the app.
Yeah.
And then you only go download the app once you've consented and you're eligible.
Right.
That's an attractive strategy because it means they don't have to uninstall it, et cetera,
Yeah.
if they're not eligible. Those are good comments, and I know a lot of other health researchers, totally outside of this type of data collection, have struggled with this issue, right? Because they're researching against sex trade workers or illegal immigrants or people who are involved in the drug trade or what have you, and they have to deal with this issue of subpoena. And I have seen some things in the literature, the academic literature, just about their situation and so on. So.
And we did have one participant who's part of, like, ours is interesting because we have qualitative at the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
So she's part of the qualitative piece, but she decided not to do the smartphone because she was aware that the phone would be tracking her, and she does participate in illegal activities. So
Sure.
she didn't want to even have the phone
Yep.
with her at any time. So she opted out not to participate in the study as a whole. So that, I think it was only one person that did that, but that is something that if they know what the data can be used for, they might just decide not to do it.
Right.
There's another piece of boilerplate related to that, which is that we kind of understand that if we determine that you are going to be harm to yourself or to others, we may disclose this to the world authorities.
Right, and that was again the notifiable information. Yeah.
Although
Yep.
this kind of data, I'm not even sure. I mean, the only thing I can think of is if there was a survey, local survey in the background, instead of answering the question, we're going to kill you all or something like that. That'd be the only kind of data we could collect.
Well, not to that sort of extent, but we were talking about studies. This the potential study,
Suicidal ideation.
Suicidal ideation. Right? So you're monitoring cohorts of people, and this is the Black Dog Institute who've got these tools that they can roll out online to assist people who are in mental distress. And if you're tracking someone's mental well-being through how you feel today, how you feel today, how do you feel suicidal, and if they're suicidal for 3 days running, and then you can roll out a particular intervention to see if that has any effect. But what if that's not, what if you have to, presumably there needs to be contingencies around, if something goes wrong in that situation as well.
But this is the same as any psychologist doing a study.
Indeed, or handing drugs out or whatever. That's right. It's the same set of issues.
Another tip is refer to IRBs or other review boards with histories of handling. So if you have a local board that doesn't have a history of dealing with this, if you can refer them to a contact at a board that does have a lot of experience, that may really reduce the time until that local board has developed confidence and conviction that this is actually it's a type of work whose risks are adequately managed and which has been scrutinized, for the ethics implications by others in a serious way. And this is something that we have done on occasion, certainly, and it's something that I think we can serve the community some by offering some contacts with our boards, because we are very privileged. I count myself just profoundly fortunate to be working with a board that's so supportive and not by any means turning a blind eye or giving blanket approval, but one that understands where the real issues are, takes time to scrutinize the things that matter and give feedback on them, and sometimes ask for changes, but at the same time put things recognize the precedent, recognize the relative significance of different items, and put it in real perspective. So I think Kevin and I are just very lucky in this regard. Yeah. Reuse earlier documentation. I distributed as part of the site, some example documents, consent forms, etc. And I think if you can build on those sort of things or use them for thinking about what yours might look like, you might be able to at least avoid reinventing the flat tire, avoid reinventing the square wheel, and only painfully moving towards a round one. This is something I've said many times, but use pilot and feasibility studies prior to large-scale studies. Develop the confidence of the board when it's still on a pilot level. Work with them, be patient, help them learn from this sort of work, and naturally err on the side of not being combative, but accommodating concerns, but pointing to precedent and discussing it with others in the community. And I'd include people here as being really good. I'm glad to hear discussions going. Some of the stuff that was going on in the discussion between Yacinda and Kevin here, gave a nod towards this final one, which is use studies that are tiered, use opt-in strategies for participants on an ethics level that are opt-in at a tiered level. So you can have multiple levels of agreement where this person agrees to have their data used for these purposes, this other one for these other purposes. It can allow for different levels of comfort to be accommodated and allow the board to see that you're being responsive to concerns. Some points for discussion with IRBs, beyond those extending from last time precedent with other studies, public nature, much visible information. I remember when we first started talking with our IRB, one of the points that came up in discussion is, well, a certain amount of this information may seem invasive or quite voluminous, but the point is there's a lot of it that's already publicly visible. There's a certain amount of things about people's movement patterns in the community or what have you, which could in principle be observed by someone in that same neighborhood. Movement of students around campus, that's the type of work Kevin's done a fair bit of work with Scott Bell on. And there's a limited expectation of privacy someone might have in that context. And ethics boards are quite attuned to this issue of the expectation of privacy and confidentiality. So one has to temper, awe at the level of detail of the data being recorded on the part of the board to point out that a lot of it is, that there's a fair bit of it that is subject to direct observation by the general public. And while it is detailed in principle, it's not that much more than what an extremely laborious manual survey would collect by direct observation following someone around or observing. The capacity to opt out, this is something Ethica really emphasizes both at the micro level, that little snooze button, and at the macro level, the leave study button that is featured on so many of the studies, where they can simply push it and say, I want to leave the study. Mohammed has also recently added this feature to allow participants browsing their own data to request deletion of the data, if I got Mohammed's comment there correctly. And it may be that something like that is rolled out at a finer grained level down the road. And then the other thing is, commercial companies, commercial companies, companies are collecting this sort of data in spades, and in some cases, such as the tobacco industry, the food industry, they're running circles around regulatory authorities and public health research. And the type of data that we're being talked about is collected with vastly more safeguards than the other data constantly being streamed off of these phones for other purposes by other groups that have no serious sort of level of informed consent involved governing their activities, and no ethics bodies that oversee their use in a significant way. So we talked about dropping out of a study, pausing data collection, opting out from a specific data source. I didn't mention that, but that's something that Ethica supports, I think, on the Android side, right? Being able to, well, you could disable your GPS, for example. And the study, if it collects GPS, will have a notification for you saying, please turn on your GPS, but you can opt out of it. And in fact, when you install the app, I think, up front, there's a certain gating that can go on now at a finer grained level, isn't there? In the latest version of Android, you could say, like, I don't want it to be used to collect this sort of information. I thought at the time of install, there was some change from that.
In the version of Android, you had to ask for permissions up front, and installing the app meant that you agree with all the permissions. That you.
Right.
But iOS latest version and Android 6, when you install, it doesn't tell you anything. But for example, when the app tries to access that specific type of data that requires that permission, it pops up. It shows a message and says, "This app tries to access camera. Would you allow? This app tries to access GPS. Would you allow?"
Right.
And then you say yes or no. And if you say no, basically the app will not have access to GPS.
Yeah. Good. Thanks. That's really helpful. And then this option of deleting data at any time. As some in the room may know, this ability to go back and delete earlier data is something that ethics studies ethics boards will sometimes really value. The retrospectively opt out, and it's something that's part of a codified body of kind of knowledge involving ethics processes and oversight. I'll just mention one form that we've actually not used this, but when we think about certain types of work, it does seem to me a possibility for down the road, which is kind of a data escrow situation where a person may be willing to opt in to offering certain types of data, knowing that that data is going to be stored in safeguard, not examined unless an urgent context comes up. Think about a situation of people opting in to share contact data only in the case of a communicable disease outbreak, or data involving gastrointestinal symptoms, subclinical and clinical level, only if a foodborne outbreak is being investigated. The presence of this data might be safeguarded, that no one examines it by default, and it's only if this contingency comes up that most people in the population would view as a sort of justifiable emergency of some sort, they might be willing to then allow that data to be analyzed and to be released to the authorities for processing. It is possible that would allow a certain amount of individuals to opt in who otherwise wouldn't be comfortable providing that sort of data. Think contact patterns, think movement patterns, think subclinical symptomology, attitudes, etc. So there is a potential there for sort of contingent level use that might satisfy both privacy concerns on the part of an individual and some ethics board concerns. Kevin, any comments you want to make before moving on as an area?
I think the other thing that you want to be cognizant of is what provisions you have for secondary use of the data. Because there's so much data that it's answering questions you didn't even know you had when you started.
Yeah.
And so understanding how you are allowed to access and publish secondary studies based on this data, I think is just something to keep in mind as you can go through the ethics process. Because it will happen. I mean, we've had 2 studies like that so far, which were actually natural experiments. We're kind of flying. If we have time tomorrow, I might just do a couple slides on
Yeah, no, that would be great.
So you have to go back and get variations, obviously, if you haven't kind of got clearance to use, you've got clearance to use the data for X, Y, and Z, but now you want to look at
Right.
A, B, and C.
So you might do a protocol
So you
modification.
might have to go for protocol
Yeah.
modification. unless you algebraically frame your objectives in
Yeah.
such a way that, you know,
So this is an
we are
interesting.
going to look at the association of things.
Things, yeah. Certainly when it comes to larger things like observatories, this is a
Yeah, yeah.
issue.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, yeah.
doing an observatory, you're going to get lots of questions. So the language around that is going to be tricky.
Yeah.
The smaller studies is easier to do with an amendment.
Yeah.
One of the things we did do was basically say we're kind of allowed to use this data to publish papers on how to use this data. So it's like purely algorithmic, not trying to draw conclusions about
Yep.
anything. And then the rest of it was based on amendments. Generally been pretty easy. So the two examples I'll talk about tomorrow with is one, we had a lockout of the transit system a couple of years ago during one of our studies. So it was like, hey, let's do a study on how the lockout affects activity. That was not the plan. Sorry. And the other one just finished yesterday was supposed to study walking behavior in different neighborhoods, and released a week before Pokemon Go came out. So we're actually probably end up doing studies on Pokemon Go. So you get these kind of weird things where events will catch up with your cohort in ways that would not have been measurable often with traditional instruments, but will show up in your data. As an academic, you don't want to ask the questions. So you have to give yourself the whole, to allow yourself to do that.
Yeah, we're going to see a real upper bound in terms of level of exposure to mosquitoes, I think.
Yeah.
Uh,
That was the other thing that got tossed in that study. So that's another thing actually is
yeah,
these kinds of studies can be run in parallel.
yeah.
So
So a given study can run several lines of, be correcting things germane to several different research questions.
Yeah, so a given
The same
data
direction.
collection event can actually have several
Yeah.
analyses embedded within it. And so you have to heavily frame, set, multi-pronged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we did mosquitoes and walking and now Pokemon all at the same time.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop